Khenpo Sodargye Loner Monum Chimborgam Gyat Agar Dargam Santo German Dor Tombate Janla Give Sham Sar Nature Rover Turning Jankam Sa Jawar to give Shanoyla Jimmy Banzo Journal Sura de Ogonjo Tobam Power Shinjilo.
The supreme, profound, and wondrous Dharma is difficult to encounter even in millions of eons. Now that we have the chance to hear and receive it, may we realize the Tathagata's true meaning. In order to liberate all sentient beings, please give rise to the supreme bodhicitta. Let us continue our study of Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way. We will now begin discussing the realization attained by a bodhisattva on the sixth Bhumi. The realization of the sixth Bhumi focuses primarily on emptiness. Yesterday we discussed the qualities of those suitable to hear about emptiness, as well as the supreme benefits of listening to these teachings. Today we begin the section on the teachings to be presented. These teachings are divided into two parts. First, establishing emptiness through logical reasoning, and second, explaining the classifications of this established emptiness. The latter part will cover the 20 types of emptiness. That is the broad outline. First, the initial outline of the doctrine establishes emptiness through reasoning. This is divided into the no-self of phenomena and the no-self of persons. We will establish the no-self of phenomena through reasoning, and then establish the no-self of persons through reasoning. The content regarding the no-self of persons will be covered later. The section on establishing the no-self of phenomena through reasoning is divided into three parts. First, refuting self-arising through reasoning. Second, establishing through reasoning that phenomena are merely dependent origination, that is, it refutes arising from inherent arising. And then establishing dependent origination through reasoning. Once we have completely refuted all forms of inherent self-arising, we still acknowledge the principle of dependent origination. Third, analyzing the effect of this reasoning-based examination. These are the three aspects of establishing no-self of phenomena through reasoning. Among these, refuting inherent arising through reasoning is divided into 2 points. First, refuting arising from the 4 extremes within the two truths. And second, dispelling objections raised against this refutation. At present, a large portion of our text focuses on refuting arising from the 4 extremes within the two truths. This is very important. When studying the middle way, one must understand how to refute arising from the 4 extremes. Following this, there is a section on dispelling objections. Refuting arising from the 4 extremes within the two truths is further divided into 3 parts. First, a brief presentation establishing that there is no arising from the 4 extremes. Second, an extensive explanation through logical reasoning. And third, a summary based on what has been established. These are the 3 parts. Therefore, today we will begin with a brief overview of the 4 extremes. We begin with a brief explanation by establishing the thesis that there is no arising from the 4 extremes. This means we first establish a thesis. Regarding a thesis, as you may know, in Buddhist logic and debate, one first establishes a thesis and then proceeds to prove it through reasoning. We first present the principal thesis and then establish it through reasoning. That is exactly the approach here. From there, the text turns primarily to refuting arising from the 4 extremes. This refutation is metaphorically called the diamond splinter reasoning. When studying the middle way, the primary method for analyzing causes is the diamond splinter reasoning. To examine the nature of things, we use the neither one nor many reasoning. The method for examining effects is the reasoning that refutes the arising of existent or non-existent effects. And the method that comprehensively examines cause, nature, and effect is the great dependent origination reasoning. These are known as the 4 great reasonings of the middle way. These 4 great reasonings are extremely important. They mean that by applying the 4 reasoning methods of the middle way, we ascertain that all phenomena are empty. In Buddhism, we often hear phrases like, the 4 elements are empty, or like a dream, like an illusion. Yet for most people, the real question remains, how exactly are things empty? They may not fully understand the method of establishing emptiness. If we truly wish to understand emptiness, we need to study the middle way. Given our short lifespan, studying all the prajna teachings would be quite challenging. For example, in the Tibetan Buddhist canon, the Prajna Sutras form a vast collection comprising 12 volumes. The other day I visited a place where they mentioned having 16 volumes of Prajna teachings. This discrepancy might be due to different editions or other reasons. In our brief human lives, facing such an extensive collection of texts, one could hardly finish reading even a single volume in a day. Thus, trying to completely study all 12 volumes is simply not realistic. This is why Tibetan Buddhism places such strong emphasis on texts like root stanzas of the Middle Way and Entering the Middle Way. If you can study these treatises well, you will essentially grasp what the Prajna teachings are conveying. This becomes very clear. You will be able to understand it clearly through doctrinal reasoning and scriptural authority. Now, when it comes to studying the Middle Way, learning the Prajna teachings on emptiness, or understanding the principle that one's own mind is inherently empty and non-dual, there are several approaches. The first approach is through Vajrayana practices like Dzogchen and Mahamudra, or the direct pointing out instructions of Chan Buddhism. A realized master uses special pith instructions to help you instantly realize the nature of your own mind, allowing you to awaken to the truth that all phenomena are empty. There have been many such enlightened masters throughout the history of Chan Buddhism, and in the traditions of Tibetan Vajrayana, especially Dzogchen, there were also many masters who awakened in this way. This represents one path for practitioners. Another approach taken by practitioners involves the generation and completion stages. They may work with the subtle energies, channels, and drops, or practice visualizing the pure mind, using these methods to recognize the nature of the mind. Alternatively, many rely on the principles that all phenomena are empty and primordially pure as a means to recognize the nature of the mind. For example, in the Kala Chakra teachings, Mipa Rinpoche explains in his commentary on the Kala Chakra, when we practice the completion stage, we rely primarily on the mind's power of visualization. We can transform our perception into a pure realm, or realize that all phenomena are empty. Both of these are valid methods. For instance, Mipham Rinpoche said that if someone hits your head with a wooden club, you will definitely feel pain. However, if someone continuously visualizes being struck on the head by an object, eventually they will also experience that same feeling of pain. This is just like the story mentioned in the flight of the Garuda. One of Nagarjuna's disciples followed his master's instructions and meditated in a cave, visualizing a horn growing on his head. He practiced this continuously, and eventually a horn actually grew on his head. He then asked his master what to do. His master replied, "Now visualize that this horn does not exist and meditate on its emptiness." Finally, the horn he had visualized simply disappeared. Through such methods, in Vajrayana and certain special pith instructions, practitioners use visualization to realize the nature of the mind. This represents the second approach. The third approach is to understand emptiness through the reasoning of the Middle Way. Studying the Middle Way is a process of rational reasoning and discernment. Naturally, studying it requires relying on both scripture and reasoning. We rely on scriptural teachings to generate faith in emptiness. This is known as scriptural authority. We rely on reasoning to establish the truth. This is known as logical reasoning. Through these scriptural authority and logical reasoning, we develop faith in the principle that all phenomena are empty, thereby truly understanding this profound truth. However, if we try to recognize the mind's nature solely by relying on scripture, it is not that easy. The volume of scripture is simply too vast, and the content is extremely profound. As mentioned earlier, only masters like Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna have the ability to interpret the scriptures through their own realization. Furthermore, some teachings may appear to be sacred scripture, but in reality they are not. This means that not all teachings qualify as authentic scripture. Only those that can be established through valid cognition can be called sacred scripture. Yet, determining whether something is established by valid cognition also requires the pith instructions of a qualified master. In fact, when studying the Middle Way, the most important aspect is what we just discussed, the application of logical reasoning. By using logical reasoning, whether someone has religious faith or no faith at all, we can directly apply logical analysis to prove the principle that all phenomena are empty. Therefore, as we study the Middle Way this time, what is our primary method? We primarily rely on reasoning to ascertain emptiness. During this process, everyone should listen with deep concentration. Whether you are here in person, although there are very few people present right now, or listening through audio and video recordings, it is important to maintain a focused mind. Without a focused mind, you might spend the entire class with your mind wandering, daydreaming. This can happen. or if you lack even a basic foundation of the middle way, it can be quite challenging because these teachings involve the specialized principles of middle way emptiness. Moreover, the content presented in Entering the Middle Way focuses almost entirely on the four extremes. It is quite similar to the root stanzas of the Middle Way. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will actually study this profound teaching, but looking at it now, the engagement has been quite good. I remember when I previously taught the root stanzas of the Middle Way, there were perhaps thousands of people present. Later, the audio recordings of those teachings were transcribed into exposition transcript, and many people have continued to study them. In truth, this kind of persistent study represents a sustainable path of learning, which is wonderful to see. Nowadays, finding a master individually or going to a monastery to study in person might be an opportunity some people will never have in this lifetime. Therefore, studying on your own through audio and video recordings is an excellent and perhaps the only practical method. It is a very accessible way to hear the Dharma. However, whether you study alone or together with a few others, if you wish to study the middle way, it is essential to study with great focus and diligence. For every structural outline and every stanza, you should examine them carefully. Without focused listening, even a slight moment of distraction or a brief lapse in attention can make it difficult to follow the logical reasoning that comes later. For example, the structural outlines in Entering the Middle Way are extremely important. Within these outlines, if you look at each level and do not understand what is being discussed, it becomes very hard to follow the logical flow from beginning to end. Therefore, during the listening process, everyone should listen carefully and follow along. By doing so, even if you do not understand it at first, I believe that many of us have a certain level of education. We have all been to school. For this basic logical reasoning, it might be a bit demanding at first, but it will get easier. When I first began listening to these teachings, I also found them a little challenging. Yet right from the beginning, I felt that this teaching was incredibly profound. After listening, I immediately began teaching it to others. Personally, I have great faith in Entering the Middle Way, but it has been over 30 years now and I have not taught it again in either Tibetan or Chinese. Some Dharma friends who have been at the Academy since 1995 mentioned that they have never heard me teach Entering the Middle Way. Even some who have stayed at the Institute all along say they have never heard it. Counting back, it must have been around 1993 and 1994. At that time, I taught it once in Tibetan and once in Chinese. Although I have not touched upon this text for such a long time, looking at it now, it still feels quite familiar. Teaching it again should not be a problem. During our study, it is important to realize that encountering such profound middle way teachings is exceedingly rare in this lifetime. We should truly appreciate how precious this opportunity is. This appreciation is very important. With this sense of preciousness, you will be better able to comprehend the meaning of the middle way. From today, I originally planned to recite the oral transmission in Tibetan. However, unlike other treatises, inserting Tibetan recitations in the middle could easily interrupt our train of thought. Therefore, we will skip the Tibetan recitation for now. In the structural outline mentioned earlier, we begin with a brief explanation by establishing the thesis of no arising from the four extremes. They do not arise from themselves. How could they arise from others? They do not arise from both. How could they arise without a cause? This brief summary will be our focus for a while. This means, as I mentioned to everyone yesterday, and as stated in the root stanzas of the Middle Way, all phenomena are empty. This emptiness is essentially defined as phenomena do not arise from themselves, nor do they arise from others. They do not arise from both, nor do they arise without a cause. Therefore, we know they are unarisen. We also quoted this stanza in the previous class. Phenomena are not self-produced, nor are they produced by others. They are not produced by both, nor are they produced without a cause. This principle is crucial. At the very beginning of the root stanzas of the Middle Way, this is exactly what is taught. Furthermore, according to the teachings in the Flower Ornament Sutra, all phenomena have no arising, and all phenomena have no cessation. All phenomena are without arising and without cessation. If one can understand this, the Buddhas will always manifest before them. This is what is stated in the Flower Ornament Sutra. Therefore, knowing that phenomena have neither arising nor cessation, if we can comprehend this ultimate reality, all Buddhas will constantly appear before us. This truth is profoundly important. So at the very beginning here, the text uses a brief approach to state they do not arise from themselves. This primarily focuses on refuting inherent arising from self. Refuting self-arising means that no phenomenon can be produced by itself. Here they refers to the effects or results, and so, as will be explained later, an effect does not arise from its own nature, because if it arose from its own nature, it would lead to many logical flaws, such as being meaningless and endless. The second aspect is, how could they arise from others? If the entity itself cannot produce the effect, could it be produced from other phenomena? This is also impossible. If self-arising is illogical, arising from others cannot be established either. Since neither self-arising nor arising from others can be established, they do not arise from both. Arising from both is equally impossible. Thus, arising from self, others, or both is entirely illogical. In fact, if self-arising cannot be established and arising from others cannot be established, then combining the two to produce an effect is also impossible. How could they arise without a cause? If self-arising and arising from others fail, how could there be causeless arising? How could something arise without a cause and produce an effect? It simply cannot. This situation cannot exist, because, as will be explained later, if an effect could arise without a cause, effects would appear randomly, anytime and anywhere, without any pattern. This leads to all sorts of logical flaws. Therefore, when we examine phenomena from the perspective of their causes, as I just mentioned, applying the logical reasoning of the middle way, we see that if all phenomena truly existed, they would have an initial arising, a middle abiding, and a final cessation. There should be a process of arising, abiding, and ceasing. Arising, abiding, and ceasing are the characteristics of conditioned phenomena. Regarding any phenomena, we tend to think in our minds whether it is myself or others, or any object in the world like a pillar or a vase. Everything has a process of initially arising, abiding in the middle, and finally ceasing. This is a universal consensus among humanity. Everyone shares this common understanding. Yet when we examine this through the reasoning of the middle way, what emerges is this: the arising of phenomena that you perceive is merely an illusion-like, dependent arising at the conventional level. An arising that possesses true, inherent existence is completely non-existent. So it is essential to understand that the arising refuted here is inherent arising. This refers to something possessing its own nature and genuinely producing a substantial entity. It does not refute the illusion like arising from causes and conditions. In fact, arising from causes and conditions is not real, it is false, just a nominal appearance of arising. Therefore, sentient beings are truly pitiful because they hold on to this grasping at true existence. Though things have never arisen, they believe they have. Though things have never abided, they believe they do. Delusions and wrong views such as these are incredibly abundant. Thus, as we study the middle way this time, we need to carefully analyze all attachments to arising, abiding, and ceasing. During this analysis, it is vital to break through our ordinary ingrained common sense. We all tend to feel that a seed produces a sprout. This is not just the view of farmers, but also that of many scholars in the world. In reality, this view is just the common sense of humanity. And when we examine this common sense through the reasoning of the middle way, it cannot withstand any scrutiny. We will analyze this point by point. Therefore, during this analysis, everyone should bring their keenest discernment to bear on these arguments. This is also important for teaching the middle way to others in the future. Next, we will proceed with the extensive explanation through logical reasoning. This section is divided into 4 parts: refuting self-arising, refuting arising from others, and then refuting arising from both and causeless arising. These are the 4 modes of arising that we must refute. Refuting self-arising is divided into 2 points. First, refuting self-arising using the reasoning of Buddha Palita and Chandrakirti. We begin here by using their reasoning to refute self-arising. Acharya Buddhapalita was a great commentator on the middle way and a truly remarkable master. He lived during the late Indian period, more than a century before Chandrakirti. We shall apply their reasoning here to refute self-arising. The second is refuting self-arising using Nagarjuna's reasoning, which is divided into 2 parts. The first is refuting self-arising on the ultimate level. Self-arising does not exist on the ultimate level. The second is to demonstrate that self-arising does not exist on the conventional level either. It does not exist on the ultimate level, nor does it exist on the conventional level. The third is a summary of the preceding 2 points. This outline is important. When I taught entering the middle way in Tibetan and Chinese previously, I required everyone to memorize all the outlines and every single stanza. By doing this, you will come to understand, at least in broad terms, what the text is conveying. Let us first look at refuting self-arising on the ultimate level. Everyone should be clear about the ultimate and conventional levels. Now, regarding refuting self-arising on the ultimate level, there are 2 points. First, refuting that an effect arises from a cause of the same nature. Arising from a cause that shares the same nature is illogical. The idea is that if self-arising were true, the effect would arise from a cause identical to itself in nature. The second is refuting the identity of cause and effect. These are the 2 points. Each of these outlines is very important. Let us look at the first, refuting arising from a cause of the same nature. Everyone understand this. For example, a pillar. A pillar has its own distinct nature, different from a vase. It possesses its own identical nature, and it is assumed to arise from a cause of the same identical nature. For instance, wheat arises from a wheat seed, and rice arises from a rice seed. Each arises from its own respective cause. Within the section on refuting arising from a cause of the same nature, we refute it through 4 aspects. First, refuting by the pointlessness of arising. Second, refuting by the illogicality of arising. Third, refuting by showing that the effect has no possibility of arising. And fourth, refuting by the infinite arising of seeds. There are these 4 aspects. Let us look at the first, refuting by the pointlessness of arising. The text here states, if it arises from itself, there is no benefit. Now, whose view are we refuting here? Actually, we are primarily refuting the view of the Samkhya school. Later, causeless arising is primarily a view of the Lokayata school. Self-arising is the view of the Samkhya school. The Samkhya school believes in conventional manifestation. All phenomena possess an inherent root nature, or pradhana. That is to say, all phenomena arise from this pradhana root nature. Therefore, the arising of phenomena is merely a transformation or manifestation of this pradhana root nature. Since they all arise from this pradhana root nature, the Samkhya school holds this view. Thus, when we refute self-arising, we are generally referring to the view of the Samkhya school. If you also believe that an effect arises from its cause, you can observe it yourself. During this examination, I ask you, for example, regarding a pillar or a sprout, if a sprout arises from a seed, do you consider it self-arising, arising from others, arising from both, or causeless arising? If you feel that it is self-arising because the sprout and its seed share the same entity and belong to the same continuum, then it must be self-arising. Many people in the world might hold this belief, but if we analyze it with middle-way reasoning, such self-arising cannot exist, because many people in the world hold the view that the effect already exists within the cause, only it does not manifest at the time of the cause. It exists in a latent potential state, and once the conditions are in place, this effect begins to emerge. If that were the case, just as in the way of the Bodhisattva, we have refuted this view. If the effect exists at the time of the cause, eating food would mean eating excrement. If what you say is true, when the effect is already present in the cause, then when we eat our meal, we would effectively be eating excrement. Because after we digest the food, it is eventually transformed into excrement. So if the effect truly exists within the cause, then what we are eating would not be food, because you hold that the cause and effect are a single entity. If they are a single entity, then eating the food would be identical to eating excrement. There are many such logical flaws. In that case, it is said that if it arises from itself, there is no benefit. If this sprout, that is the effect, were to arise from its own entity or from its own inherent nature, it would be really illogical. Why is it illogical? As we discussed earlier, a sprout itself is a phenomenon that possesses an inherent nature. If it were produced from the inherent nature of the seed, then does the sprout exist in the original seed? If the sprout does not exist within the seed, your claim of self-arising cannot be established, because if there is no sprout in the seed itself cannot produce a sprout. If it was not originally in the seed, but yet another phenomenon arises, that is not self-arising but rather causeless arising. If you claim there is a sprout even though it is not in the seed, then you are saying that the sprout as the effect is already there in the seed. Since the effect already exists in the seed, then this newly arisen effect would be meaningless and have no benefit, because when any phenomenon arises, it has a specific function or a specific capacity. But this arising is now completely unnecessary, because you claim the effect is already in the cause. Since the effect already exists, what is the point of producing it again? Because the seed itself already possesses the effect. If the seed already possesses the effect and produces it again, as will be explained later, it is entirely meaningless. Take the cup in front of us, for example. If this cup already exists in the cause, there is no need to produce a new cup, because the effect is already produced. So everyone should be clear about this. If you admit that there is a truly existent self-arising, this flaw will inevitably follow. This is not something we in the Middle Way school impose on you, demanding you to accept this view. That is not the case. In reality, if you claim that a phenomenon with inherent existence exists, then does the effect exist in the cause? If the effect exists in the cause, then the arising is unnecessary, because at the causal stage the effect already exists inherently. Consequently, the newly arisen effect has no benefit. Conversely, if the effect does not exist in the seed, then self-arising cannot be established. For instance, the seed does not contain the son of a barren woman, therefore it cannot produce the son of a barren woman. There are many such points. In this way, inherent arising is completely meaningless. If the effect already exists within the nature of the seed, then producing the effect is meaningless. You are merely talking about self-arising, but it is an empty term, fruitless and pointless entirely. Because the definition of arising is that something previously non-existent comes into being. This is what we call arising. But this arising you acknowledge, if it already exists fully in the cause, then what is the meaning of this arising? The effect is clearly already there in the cause, yet you claim it arises again. This leads to various logical flaws. This is illogical. Next we discuss refuting by the illogicality of arising. If it is self-arising, this arising is illogical, nor is it reasonable that what has already arisen should arise again. For the word again in the verse, it is better to change it to already, meaning already arisen. In Tibetan, I am not sure which word the Master Fazun's translation used. Already arisen is likely better. The meaning of the verse, nor is it logical that what has already arisen should arise again, is that since you acknowledge self-arising, you accept that the sprout has already arisen. Since it has already arisen, producing it again has no meaning. This is really illogical. It cannot be established by valid cognition. For example, if a son is already born, then there is no need for him to be born again. If he has already been born and is born again, this would lead to the flaw of infinite arising. Some might think this is not the case. The first son is born, then the second son can be born. To this we can ask, are the second son and the first son the same entity or distinct entity at the causal level? This is a very important question. If they are different entities, for instance, a mother and son are separate entities. If mother and son are two different entities, then that is not self-arising, it is arising from others. Because the son is not the mother and the mother is not the son, these two different entities cannot be called self-arising. If you insist that it is self-arising, then it becomes the self-producing itself. This becomes illogical. Why is it illogical? If you have truly become another phenomenon, are you still yourself? You can examine this. If it is yourself, as I just explained, if the effect already exists in the cause, there is no need to arise again. If it is not yourself, then it is not self-arising. Therefore, if the effect has already arisen, and there is already arising in the cause, then producing it again is unnecessary. The already in the verse, nor is it logical that what has already arisen should arise again, including the arising mentioned before, is completely meaningless. Furthermore, in this context, it is also illogical. Actually, some of these reasonings belong to Chandrakirti, while others belong to Buddha Palita. This is the reasoning of Buddha Palita. This brings us to the second aspect. You should also understand that if self-arising were true, since the phenomenon has already arisen, it would be illogical for it to arise again. The previous point was about the meaninglessness of self-arising, and this point is about the illogicality of self-arising. The third outline is refuting, by showing that the effect has no possibility of arising. The stanza says, if you claim what has already arisen arises again, then it would follow that sprouts and the like should not arise at all. If your conceptual mind thinks that something that has already arisen is not sufficient with just one arising, but needs to arise again, for example in the case of a sprout, it has already manifested as an effect and yet the sprout arises again. Initially it existed in the causal stage in an unmanifest way, and now it arises again, so it continues to arise repeatedly. Such a claim is truly illogical. Why is it illogical? Because if you acknowledge self-arising, then when the effect arises, the preceding seed would first need to be extinguished. If the seed is not extinguished, the effect cannot arise. Without the seed being extinguished, the effect cannot arise. But if an effect is to arise according to your view, the seed is not extinguished because the seed is the phenomenon itself. Therefore, the seed is not extinguished. But if it is impossible for the seed to be extinguished, then the seed can only produce more of itself, while sprouts, stems, trees, flowers, and so on, this entire array of diverse phenomena, would have no opportunity to arise. Why is this? Because you acknowledge self-arising. If you acknowledge self-arising, then it can only produce another seed of the same kind, producing seed after seed. Thus it eternally becomes nothing but a seed, and there is no opportunity to produce any other phenomena. For example, on our computer, if it is eternally in a state of system freeze, then other phenomena cannot appear on the desktop screen. The frozen image can only remain on the screen. It can only manifest that way. If the seed is self-arising, then the seed cannot be extinguished. If the seed is extinguished and then a sprout is produced, then I ask, are the sprout and the seed one entity or distinct entities? If they are one entity, then as the flaws mentioned below, the sprout is equivalent to the seed, and the seed is equivalent to the sprout. If the sprout and seed are distinct entities, then that is not self-arising. This because two different entities certainly cannot be self-arising. For example, Devadatta and Kandra cannot be the same continuum, which we will explain later. So what is explained here is this: if you think self-arising has already occurred, then arising again is impossible. If it arises again, it would only be producing the seed over and over again. Other effects like fruits, flowers, or sprouts would have no opportunity to arise. In this way, the seed itself is always enjoying the opportunity to arise, while other phenomena never have the opportunity to arise. Therefore, in our examination, it might be a little challenging, but if you truly understand its reasoning, it is very interesting, because you cannot refute it at all. On the surface, each of Chandrakirti's lines seems quite simple, sentence after sentence, easy enough to follow. But to truly grasp why self-arising is illogical takes real effort. The fourth is refuting by the infinite arising of seeds. This refutation is based on the flaw of infinite arising. Until the end of existence, only the seed arises. Following your view, as I already mentioned, the seed produces the seed continuously, and the seeds have become infinite. Because, as we mentioned earlier, if it is self-arising, then diverse phenomena like sprouts, fruits, and flowers would have no chance to arise at all. In the vast cycle of samsara, each seed only continuously produces itself. For instance, a wheat seed produces infinite wheat seeds, producing seeds upon seeds. If this continues, the seeds become infinite and cover the entire world. If seeds are continuously produced, as I will discuss later, for instance, the farmer growing crops would have no purpose. Why? Because the farmer plants the seed. And when it produces the sprout and the fruit, the farmer wants the fruit, not the seed. But if you acknowledge self-arising, the seed would only produce itself, and no one would ever be able to obtain a sprout. Any so-called arising would be meaningless. As stated in the commentary on valid cognition, if the cause is complete, the effect cannot be prevented. If the causes are complete, the effect will not fail to appear. What is a seed? A phenomenon that produces an effect is called a seed. So if a seed can produce itself, it would certainly only produce itself. If it produces itself, this would hinder the arising of other fruits. Other phenomena would never have an opportunity to arise, because it is a seed after all. Since it is a seed, as it continuously produces, it is very likely that it only produces itself. Ultimately, there is never an opportunity to produce the effect. This opportunity never exists. So according to our reasoning here, if you are like the Samkhya proponents, who acknowledge that all phenomena are self-arising, it indicates that such wrong views persist in your mental continuum. If someone asks, is this effect produced by itself or is it produced by others? Many people might answer that it is produced by itself. For instance, a tree or a flower. Does it arise from itself or from others? Many people might feel that the flower is produced by its own seed and is therefore self-arising. We may accept this concept of self-arising, but this concept is merely a nominal designation. You may conventionally designate it however you like, but does self-arising have any genuine reality? There is none. Therefore, through studying Entering the Middle Way, we understand that the arising of all phenomena is really illogical. Do phenomena arise at all? There is a kind of arising, but what kind of arising is this? It is dependent arising. But this dependent arising is merely a nominal designation. If something arises through the illusory assembly of causes and conditions, in fact there is no identical effect that arises. Therefore this samsara might seem to possess a complete set of operations and laws, but in reality it is a thoroughly deceptive illusion. Through this reasoning, the middle way has long since dismantled our grasping at inherent existence. Every sentient being believes that these things are truly existent, yet Buddhism long ago stated that all phenomena are empty. All phenomena are empty is not just a theoretical slogan. In reality, it is genuinely empty. But when we apply this reasoning to examine things, if our logical conclusion is that all phenomena have never arisen, then abiding and ceasing are also non-existent. So if we begin refuting from self-arising, I believe that many people should be able to understand this reasoning. So if the seed produces seeds continuously, then the seed will remain in this singular continuum. Other effects like fruits, flowers, and trees will never have the opportunity to arise because it is a seed that produces itself. But in real life it is not so. In real life a farmer plants seeds and everyone consumes the fruit. So whether it is the Samkhya school or other people in the world, if they believe that a sprout is self-arising, this view is completely illogical. Then we discuss refuting the identity of cause and effect, which is divided into 2 points. If cause and effect were identical, there should be no distinct stages. This is the first point. If there are distinct stages, then cause and effect are certainly not identical. That is to say, refuting the identity of cause and effect has 2 outlines. The first is if cause and effect are identical, there should be no distinct stages. This is divided into 2 aspects. First, the illogicality of the change between cause and effect. Second, thereby it should be established that shapes, etc. are not different. Divided into these 2 aspects. Let us look at the first point. What is it? Mepom Rinpoche's structural outlines are very famous. To explain Entering the Middle Way, we have consulted many commentaries. However, these commentaries are sometimes too detailed, sometimes too brief. To truly grasp the essence of Entering the Middle Way, the structural outlines are very important. Moreover, I find that Khenpo Depa's commentary is neither too detailed nor too brief, which is excellent. If it is too extensive because of the vast content, we have several books when we study it, and it can be difficult. If it is too brief, because this treatise involves a great deal of rigorous reasoning, a few sentences may not be enough to resolve the issues, so these outlines are also very important. Now we are discussing here is self-arising, otherwise it would not be clear what follows. If we proceed on the basis of self-arising, as mentioned earlier, if the cause and effect are identical, then we cannot see distinct stages. Since cause and effect are identical, it would be illogical for any transformation to occur. So how does the opponent respond? They argue, how can the effect destroy its cause? When presenting their defense, they still put forward some reasoning. They claim that while they acknowledge the sprout arises from the seed and the sprout share the same nature, it is simply that they exist in different stages. For instance, a grey seed, when favorable conditions like sunlight and water are present, gradually transforms into a sprout. Even as it becomes a sprout, it remains one and the same nature. Therefore, the flaws of arising from others do not apply here, because they share the same nature. The sprout and the seed are of the same nature. In this case, only the process differs. In reality, they are of the same nature. This is what the opponent maintains. But if it were as you say, it would still be illogical. How can it destroy itself? If the seed and sprout are of the same nature, why is it said that one destroys the other? Here it refers to the effect, the sprout. Why can the sprout destroy the seed? If sprout and seed were of the same nature, then one destroying the other would be like killing oneself. This is illogical. Because both the seed and the sprout are self-arisen, they are both self-arisen. If that is the case, why would your green sprout destroy its own seed? Because they share the same nature. If they share the same nature but are yet different, they become different entities. In reality, seed and sprout are like what we call ABC or ABCD and so on. If the seed stage is A, then when it reaches the sprout stage, are you A or B? If the sprout is A, then the sprout is the seed and the seed is the sprout. This contradicts conventional appearances. If you say the seed is A and the sprout is B, then later when it transforms into fruit and stem, these are different stages like C, D, E and so on. Thus every object undergoes these different stages of change, which certainly cannot be self-arising. It should already be arising from others, because the forms of the sprout and the seed are fundamentally different. If so, why would you become the effect of the sprout, and why would you destroy the cause, which is your own seed? You clearly claim it is self-arising, yet in self-arising, why would you destroy the seed stage, which is your own self? Because if the seed is not destroyed, it seems the sprout cannot be produced. So these logical flaws still exist. Here we should, well, how should I put it? Everyone here, well, I'm not sure how to say it. We should be able to examine it. If you truly acknowledge self-arising, then the different stages you speak of, the seed stage and the sprout stage, these two stages should not exist actually. But the opponent believes that self-arising exists, and we ourselves may often think this way too, that the seed and sprout are one entity. But it was originally a seed, and through the accumulation of various causes and conditions, it becomes a sprout. Seed and sprout are one continuum and one entity. They simply have different functions. But strictly speaking, for instance, as we often say, the self of yesterday and the self of today cannot be identical. If they were identical, there would be many flaws in terms of moments, time, and age. From many aspects, when we examine strictly, these views are also illogical. So here we also provide a refutation. Next, by this it should result in no difference in shape and so on. The second outline is, thereby shapes and so on should be indistinguishable. This is the first. If you see different stages, then cause and effect are certainly not identical. That is to say, refuting the identity of cause and effect has two outlines. The first is, if cause and effect are identical, there should be no distinct stages. This is divided into two aspects. First, the illogicality of the change between cause and effect. Second, thereby it should be established that shapes, etc., are not different. Divided into these two aspects. What is the first point? Regarding this point, there is hardly anyone who can comprehend or accept it. How are they different? For instance, consider the form of the cause. First, we speak of the shape of the cause and sprout. The term shape refers to the physical form. For example, a seed is granular in shape, while a sprout is long and thin. The sprout and the seed, their shapes are certainly not the same. Then we examine their appearance, which refers to their color. Seeds are generally gray. They do not have any particularly intense color, but when it becomes a sprout, it reveals a green color, or when it blooms, there are various different colors of flowers. Next, we examine their taste. The seed may have no distinct taste, but when it becomes a sprout, it may have sweet or bitter tastes of various kinds. Then we examine their capacity. As a seed, its only function is to germinate, but when it reaches the stage of effect, it has the functions of growth and maturation. The examination of maturation is also the same. For instance, the amalaka fruit mentioned in the commentary, also known as the emblic myrobalan, at the seed stage, it has a rather bitter and astringent taste. But when soaked in milk or other juices, it eventually becomes very sweet, and so on. When we examine these from various aspects, looking at both cause and effect, they are certainly not the same phenomenon. In terms of maturation conditions and so on, from every perspective, cause and effect are certainly not the same. Therefore, they do not have a relationship of self-arising. If it were self-arising, why would the traits possessed by the cause not be possessed by the effect? This is completely illogical. These are all directly perceivable facts. Even farmers can see this. When we studied entering the middle way in the past, there was a herdsman named Louis near our academy. At that time, conditions at the academy were quite difficult. There was another herdsman before Louis, whose name I have forgotten. At that time, every day at noon, they would bring yaks to the academy. His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok said, "When I was studying, I was also in the same situation. It was quite difficult for students. If we could have some milk, it would be very helpful for sustaining our lives. When we first arrived, there were not many people at the academy. In the summer at noon, that family would bring the yaks, and after milking them, each of us would receive roughly about this much. Life was not very easy back then, but that milk was very precious. Although everyone did not get much, at noon every day we would all take our bowls to get our share. But during our debates, we would often bring up the herdsman, one named Louis, and I have forgotten the other's name, because they were illiterate. When we debated, we would cite examples of people who were not very learned, and we would often say, just like Louis, the herdsman Louis, even he could directly perceive it. You see the difference between the seed and the sprout, not to mention those of us with some education, even Louis could perceive it. The sprout and seed have different tastes, different shapes, different colors, different functions, and different capacities. We would always use this example. Therefore, one cannot acknowledge that sprout and seed are the same entity. If they were the same entity, then all these colors and shapes would all become identical. That is also illogical. Then the next outline says, if you see different stages, then cause and effect are not identical. This is divided into two aspects. First, if states are different, then oneness is illogical. Second, if there is oneness, then both states should be simultaneously seen or not seen, divided into these two aspects. Let us discuss these two. First, the first one. If the states are different, then oneness is certainly illogical. We analyzed this just now. The state and color of the cause and the effect are different. Therefore, the identity of the two is certainly illogical. How is it stated in the verses? If the preceding nature is abandoned and a new nature is formed, how can you claim they are one and the same nature? The opponent argues like this. Even though their color, shape, and taste are different, in reality, it is the very nature of the seed that has transformed into this new state. The seed and the sprout share one nature. They reason this way. Take a person, for example. He wears white clothes in the morning and black clothes in the afternoon, yet the person himself has not changed. In the same way, the seed was originally gray, and now it has transformed into a green sprout. It was originally bitter in taste, and now it has become sweet. So the sprout and the seed form one continuum, and their form has simply changed at different stages. In fact, many ordinary people hold this view, but in reality the seed producing the sprout is merely a continuum established by convention as a nominal designation. The idea of genuine self arising as a single entity is also illogical. Why is it illogical? If one abandons the preceding stage, if the gray phase of the seed is completely and truly left behind, entirely discarded, and transforms into a phenomenon of a different nature, becoming another nature, then why do you still insist that the later sprout is the very nature of the preceding seed? This is fundamentally illogical. By the time the sprout appears, the preceding seed no longer exists, and not even the slightest part of its original substance remains. Some of us might think, when I eat sunflower seeds, I am enjoying the fruit. Some teachers previously conducted cultivation experiments using sunflower seeds in the laboratories. But in reality, when the fruit arises, the cause that produced it cannot possibly still exist. If the cause still existed, then if you place the empty sunflower seed husk elsewhere, it would be impossible for new sunflower seeds to grow from it. So what happens is that within a deluded appearance, we mistakenly take it to be a continuum of cause and effect, but in reality, cause and effect cannot exist at the same time. If they were simultaneous, the effect would not need to arise, since it would already be fully present within the cause. And if they are not simultaneous, then as the later sprout arises, the preceding cause must certainly cease. If the cause has not ceased, then claiming that the effect is produced no longer makes any sense, because it is no longer functioning as a cause. This logic is actually quite straightforward. So if the inherent nature of the preceding seed has clearly been abandoned, and after it has been abandoned, you still insist the seed is the very nature of the sprout is the very nature of the seed, and the two are a single entity, that is really a strange thing to say. This view is quite contradictory. Even an ordinary person would likely find it unacceptable, so this view is also illogical. Next comes the point, if they are one entity, both states should be seen or not seen simultaneously. This means that if these two phenomena are the same entity, there should not be two different states at all. And if a single entity does have two states, then both states should be perceivable at the same time, or neither state should be perceivable at all. That is the consequence. If cause and effect are truly one entity, then at the stage of the cause, the effect should already be visible, and at the stage of the effect, the cause should still be visible. That is what it would mean. If you claim that sprout and seed are not different, the sprout should be just as imperceptible as the seed. Or since they share one nature, the seed should be just as perceptible as the sprout. In either case, this cannot be accepted. If you claim means if the opponent believes. If you hold that the seed and the sprout are not two separate phenomena but are phenomena sharing one nature, then we have a very clear response. We can refute it as follows. The form of the sprout should be identical to that of the seed, and therefore the sprout should not be perceivable as something distinct. Because at the stage of the sprout we all know that the sprout is green, it has its own taste, its own color, and its own shape. But according to this view, the sprout should not display any characteristics different from the seed. It should look exactly like the seed, with no sprout characteristics perceivable whatsoever. The two should present identical states. Why is that? Because the sprout and the seed are of one nature. The color of the sprout is green, yet when the sprout appears, one should not see green at all. One should see exactly the same gray granular form as the original seed, and should not be able to perceive the sprout at all. That is the flaw in this position. Or conversely, we can reason, since they are of one nature, because the sprout and seed are of one nature, the seed should be just as perceivable as the sprout. This means that all the characteristics of the sprout should be fully perceivable in the gray seed. Why? Because you yourself acknowledge that the sprout and seed share one nature. The middle way is actually quite wonderful. It really helps sharpen our capacity for analytical thinking. As people age, they may gradually become less inclined to engage in deep thinking. When we stop reflecting and contemplating, stop moving our bodies, our physical faculties gradually begin to decline. The mind stays in a constant state of dullness and confusion, and over time one can easily develop dementia. Middle way reasoning, on the other hand, may seem difficult or only partly understood at first, but in engaging with it, it actually stimulates our mind and our brain in a very real and meaningful way. It has the effect of awakening the brain's deeper potential and stimulates our own cognitive potential. That is why the middle way is so worthwhile. So let us continue our examination. If the sprout and the seed were one entity, then either at the sprout stage everything should look exactly like the seed, with nothing new perceivable, and that is the flaw on one side. Or alternatively, at the stage of the seed, everything that belongs to the sprout should already be fully perceivable, including the sprout itself and the eventual harvest. For example, when we plant potatoes, the seed potato itself cannot be eaten, and even if eaten, it would not fill you up, but the fruit of that seed, the actual potato, can be eaten. Now, if the potato can be eaten, and yet you maintain that cause and effect are self-arisen, then you should not be able to eat the potato at all, because it shares one nature with the seed, and conversely, the seed should also be edible, and eating one or two seeds should leave you just as full as eating several potatoes. Since you hold that the two share the same nature, that is why the treatise concludes this cannot be accepted. So it is best not to hold that view. This is a supplementary argument added by Chandrakirti. Why does he keep supplementing the arguments of Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti? In reality, the principles of middle way emptiness as taught by the Buddha in the sutras were also elaborated by Nagarjuna in his root stanzas of the middle way, which included reasoning that refutes self-arising. Building upon Nagarjuna's reasoning, the master Buddhapalita, one of the great commentators on the middle way, he also offered some additional reasoning, such as the one we discussed earlier, that self-arising carries the flaw of infinite arising. Then Chandrakirti, across his various commentaries, also contributed additional logical reasonings to refute self-arising. So later scholars examining the tradition noticed that some arguments come from Nagarjuna himself, while others are the supplementary arguments of Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti. Coming up, there is a dedicated outline that will cover Nagarjuna's own arguments refuting self-arising, followed by Chandrakirti's arguments, and then Buddhapalita's arguments. These three great holy beings each brought their full efforts to completely dismantle the view of self-arising. Once self-arising is refuted, you will all be able to sleep soundly at night. With self-arising out of the picture, in a few more days we will have taken care of arising from others as well. And refuting arising from both and causeless arising is comparatively straightforward. Many of us feel overwhelmed by afflictions. So let us ask, are these afflictions self-arisen, arisen from others, or arisen from both? If afflictions are self-arisen, then are the seed of affliction and the effect of affliction one entity or two separate entities? We can investigate it in exactly this way. Although most of the reasoning here is based on examining external inanimate objects, you can take that same reasoning and apply it to ask, within our mental continuum, are afflictions one entity or two separate entities? Examining it this way, one can come to a thorough understanding. Studying the middle way can truly sever our grasping at existence. When you have genuinely understood it, it will have a profound impact on your ability to see through the illusions of the world. And the power of that insight is immense. Ordinarily, we are intensely attached to all phenomena, and as a result, the attachment grows and the suffering deepens. As the suffering deepens, the world as you see it begins to change. The world can start to feel like a very dark and unsettling place. But if we turn to logical inquiry, we can come to see clearly the illusory nature of this world, and our grasping at true existence will surely begin to ease up to some degree. If that grasping dissolves, the world you inhabit will no longer seem so unbearable. Little by little, the world will become truly bright, auspicious, and peaceful. And so many masters of the past, on one hand, recognize the nature of their own minds through Dzogchen. That is one path. Another path is for those who are heavily caught up in conceptual thinking and deeply rooted in wrong views. They can study entering the middle way. Because when wrong views are deeply entrenched, it does not matter if one does not yet acknowledge the Buddha or does not yet acknowledge the three jewels. But as long as one acknowledges the truth, then in the face of truth we can ask, do all phenomena truly exist or not? That is something we can examine together through reasoning. And once we engage in that inquiry, eventually you will come to see that all phenomena truly are indeed devoid of inherent existence, and that no phenomena arises from itself. And if there is no self-arising, then where does the reasoning that refutes self-arising come from? It has been passed down to us by the Buddha and Nagarjuna and transmitted by Chandrakirti, as well as by the great Buddhist masters throughout the generations. From ancient times down to the present, the lineage masters have preserved and passed this truth down without interruption. This is a truly precious treasure for all of humanity. In so many ways, the spiritual poverty and inner deprivation of human beings is truly alarming. If in this lifetime we come to realize that this entire world is illusory and without inherent substance, it is as though we have been living inside a dream. Much like the world depicted in the film Inception, the world is like an extraordinarily deep and multi-layered dream, yet most people remain completely unaware of this. That if one day we truly awaken from this dream, even though we are still living in this dreamlike world, the way we live in it will be entirely different. In the past, many great masters and ordinary people were put in prison, though they were all confined in the same prison. The great masters experienced no suffering in their hearts and were even able to joyfully help those around them. Ordinary people, however, not only easily give rise to anger, but may even resort to killing and accumulate grave negative karma, eventually leading to all kinds of unfortunate consequences. So while human beings share the same human life, what truly sets us apart is our inner realization. When our inner realization differs, the way we live naturally differs as well. One way of living is marked by ease, while the other is filled with struggle. So when it comes to studying the middle way, I personally feel, especially in the complex world we live in today, those who are strongly attached suffer tremendously. So in a world as complex as this, if we can study the middle way, even if we cannot immediately let go of our attachments, at least our understanding of the nature of the world will help us not cling so tightly when we encounter even the slightest setback. We used to cling to the belief that the world was truly beautiful and real, and our grasping at the inherent existence of all phenomena had become deeply entrenched. But after studying the middle way, we begin to realize that phenomena are not as real as we once imagined. In reality, we are living inside a world of illusion. If even a seed of doubt about this begins to take root in your mind, it will surely be of tremendous benefit to this life and to your future lives. That is all for today.
Bandangara Padma Sada Bandangara Padma Sada